Spencer Brown is Young America's Foundation's spokesman. He routinely travels to colleges and universities to manage some contentious situations. You've traveled with Mr. Shapiro, have you
Quite
not?
a bit, yeah.
And yet here he is alive to tell his story. He helps out the YAF students around the country, and he is also an opinion contributor for The Hill. I did not know that. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Great. So when you look at this culture, when you hear someone like the professor at Ripon University saying we don't need to remember 9/11, and you've seen so much around the country, what do you think? What is your response to that?
Well, I think the first thing to look at is just how bad higher education has got. When this is a professor at Ripon College who's basically telling students they don't need to learn anymore because it's something that happened before they were born. And obviously that's sort of the form that YAF's 9/11 Never Forget project has taken on now. It was started in 2003 in order to sort of push back on the left's attempts to make it a politically correct, sanitized remembrance that you talked about. But now, you know, students, high school freshmen especially, they weren't alive when 9/11 happened. College freshmen, a lot of college students today have no memory of that day. I was only in second grade when it happened, so even my memories, you know, are hazy at this point. But when you look at professors who are saying we don't need to remember bad events in history because they happened before we were alive, you know, where does that stop? Is he going to stop teaching about the Holocaust because it happened before he was alive? Is he going to stop teaching, you know, about anything? Where does the line fall then once you start trying to censor history in a way that it basically protects this fragile leftist ideology?
It is the ideology. I mean, one of the things I remember on 9/11 is thinking, well, there goes multiculturalism, but they cling to it like a stone, basically.
Absolutely, multiculturalism, but not you know, any sort of ideological diversity. They're all about certain kinds of diversity, but what I see, especially, you know, on all these college campuses, if you're a conservative, you don't have rights when you walk through the door, and obviously that's unconstitutional, and the grounds for several lawsuits YAF has right now, but it's something that, you know, we continue to push back on, but the left is not easing up, especially in the age of Trump.
So when I go for YAF and I talk at universities, I see these young people. You cannot, I mean, if you ever want to feel like hopeful, you look at these young people. They're so smart, so bright, so brave. But talk about a little bit of what you see them facing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think most people would be surprised. You know, the media, somewhat to their credit, has started to cover these situations, and it's part of my job as the spokesman at YAF to make sure that people understand what it's actually like to be a conservative on these campuses. But it takes so many different forms depending on the school. You know, at some schools, it is the students who are so intolerant, and so you'll have them, you know, anytime a Young Americans for Freedom chapter tries to table on their campus and pass out, for example, pocket constitutions, the students will run over and tell them, you know, this is inappropriate behavior, this is triggering to me, I don't like this document because it was written, you know, far too long ago by racist, slave-holding white men and all these things. And then other times, you know, sort of more nefariously, there's this anti-conservative bias that's sort of institutionalized in higher education today. And so you see these schools, whether it be UC Berkeley or the University of Wisconsin in Madison, University of Connecticut, where they use the bureaucracy of the administration in order to shut down conservatives through preventing them from using rooms, you know, telling them that they can't speak in a certain venue at a certain time of day because they don't want conservatives on campus after dark because that would be dangerous. That's what Berkeley initially told us when we were working to bring Ben Shapiro there. And so they just sort of use this multi-pronged approach in order to make it so that way conservatives don't have a voice on their campus. Because again, you know, what we find on these campuses when YAF is able to bring in one of these speakers, there are a lot more conservatives than you think exist. They're just sometimes so suppressed that they just feel like it's useless for them to even get out and be active.
Now, for a while, it seemed to me, I mean, Shapiro faced virtual riots. I mean, he was really surrounded by violent people. Some of these Antifa people are really dangerous. And yet, from a distance at least, it seems a little bit, this has calmed down. Is that fair to say?
I think it's interesting right now because we're just coming back into the school year. So over the summer, things sort of calmed down just because there's nothing happening on campuses. But, you know, already kicking off this year, we had Ripon College, you know, told the students there who were doing the 9/11 Never Forget project today, one of more than 200 schools doing the project, but they told them that the Never Forget posters we have, which if you're familiar with them, they have a photo of the Twin Towers that are burning, they have photos of other attacks carried out by radical Islamic terrorists. And the school said that these are inappropriate posters because they're, you know, just only singling out this one religion. And so they told the students, the body that held this meeting is called the Bias Protocol Board, which just sounds like hell to go into a meeting with them. But they basically told these students, you know, that if you're going to single out one religion, these constitute bias and they're not welcome on our campus. And so they said things like the Iran hostage crisis was not, you know, related to Islam at all. They said that they didn't think the Pulse nightclub shooting was something that should be included because it means more to the LGBT community. And so by using it on their poster, the YAF chapter was sort of appropriating LGBT culture. And they just run through all these weird objections to try to tell students, you know, that what you're doing is either stupid or useless or at worst, you know, offensive and harmful. And so you have to push back against it. And you mentioned being bold and needing people to stand up. And what we find is when students when they stand up and are bold advocates for conservatism, they usually are able to win the day.
It is amazing the way they strip Islamist terrorists of their own personal motives. The guy who shot up in the gay nightclub was on the phone with police saying, "I'm doing this for ISIS. I'm doing, I'm doing this." That was his statement. And yet then we see people who write for the New York Times actually explaining, no, that's not why it is. When you go in, do you go in and have conversations with things like this Orwellian board?
Yeah, it kind of depends. A lot of times, it's the students who are on the front lines, so they're really the real brave ones, because every single day they try to stand up and hand out a constitution or, God forbid, a Bible or whatever it may be. They're the ones who get the brunt of this assault from the left on campuses. But from time to time, when it comes to these campus lectures, I travel to a lot of them to help make sure that our story is getting out there, because often the press will try to, carry water for the leftist administration and whatever else. And so I'll go in and say, this is ridiculous what's happening. I had to do that at Berkeley. I had a little kind of guerrilla press conference on the steps of one of the buildings there, because the school's chancellor had called a secret press conference to try to throw us under the bus and say that how dare we cause them to spend $600,000 and bring in 700 police officers, to which I held my little press conference and said, how dare you have a college or a university where your students can't handle opposing ideas? This is ridiculous. This is all your fault. It's not our fault that your students need Play-Doh and a puppy in order to have Ben Shapiro somewhere in the vicinity. And so when it comes to those
to be fair,
things,
I also need Play-Doh and a puppy. That would be
but it's just, when you talk to these administrators, they just think it's so beyond the pale that there would be a conservative who dares to want to speak on their campus, and that you would try to bring in a differing viewpoint, because for them, they need their echo chamber. Because as you see, if a conservative idea is expressed, the leftists kind of have to question what they're saying, because it's not based in fact, it's not based in history. And I think that's why we see them trying to just erase history that's sort of the inconvenient truth.
Well, at any point, these are theoretically intellectuals. These are people dedicated to thought and dedicated to teaching. Have you ever encountered anybody on these in campus administration? Because I'm appalled that the administration would be a part of this. It's one thing to have radical students, we've always had those, but to have anybody in the administration shut down speech. Do you ever meet people who sort of are willing to talk it out, or actually receptive to what you're saying?
Every now and then there are a few closeted conservatives who will come up to me who are in the administration, or somebody will come up and very quietly sort of pull me aside at an event. This happened at the University of Utah last year, and pull me over to the side and just sort of quietly said, just so you know, we have your back, but I can't make a statement supporting your right to be here, because if I do, the students will revolt.
But what about a leftist who says, well, let's sit down and reason together?
That's very rare. I think there was one event we held actually at Berkeley last spring, where Dennis Prager spoke with 3 different leftist students there, who were able to agree to sit down with him and just have an honest, frank conversation on a stage in front of a packed house, talking about what do you think about free speech? Why do you think conservatives are so mistreated here? All these things. And it was, I think, kind of unfair for the leftist students, because they're going up against Dennis Prager, who has a career of doing this, and they're just students in college trying to figure everything out. But it was interesting to see that when there is an open exchange of ideas, there were points of agreement on both sides. But oftentimes, the left doesn't want to concede that. And more often than not, we warn our students against people saying, let's have a conversation about it. Because typically the left, that's sort of one of their dirty tricks, is they say, okay, you want to bring, Andrew Klavan in to speak. We think in order to better serve the students, we need to have a counterpoint present as well. So they would try to force the students to have a leftist on stage with you to sort of, couch all of everything you say with what they want to have said. And so we warn against the word, conversation, dialogue, because to the left, it doesn't mean actual conversation or dialogue. It means we tell you what you're going to say and you quietly kind of go in the corner.
Wow, because I have to say that sometimes talking to left-wing students, when I challenge their ideas, they actually start to breathe rapidly. I'm not joking. They breathe rapidly and their eyes start blinking as if you had awakened them from a trance.
That's called triggering. Yeah.
That's triggering. Yeah, it's actually triggering. I was wondering what that was. I say that all the time. So, since you have a lot of experience doing this at this point, what are the things that keep you up at night? What are the things that you're afraid of, the bad trends that you see?
I think one of the really scary trends is schools who are unafraid of being held accountable at this point, where we had, for a while, there were schools where if you were to send a demand letter, if they were trying to prevent a conservative from speaking in a venue or something, we would send a demand letter, they would realize they were about to violate the Constitution and would make amends. And now we see schools becoming more bold, partially at the administrative level, because they're so afraid of their students, because they've seen what students do. When conservatives speak at CSULA, the leftist students will go camp out in the president's office for 3 days and have a hunger strike in the office until he recants and says, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have had a conservative at this school. And so I think people being unafraid of the fact that the Constitution is there and binds their activities is something that's alarming, and it becomes a really big issue where we've been engaged in this lawsuit against UC Berkeley over their treatment of Shapiro and other conservatives for almost 2 years now. And so the schools know that they can drag out these lawsuits because, especially with UC Berkeley, it's all taxpayer money, and everybody knows California can tax until, they literally bankrupt the state. And so you have these situations where they are just trying to delay basically due process for conservatives. And that's something that's alarming because it gets you in a place where you can't bring a conservative in while this lawsuit is going on because they won't make amends for what they've done.
I see.
I think the other really concerning thing is students who are just becoming, everybody always uses a snowflake metaphor, these students are so fragile. But I think what we're seeing is students sort of adopting the Trump derangement syndrome side of things and not just being fragile, but also becoming just outwardly violent and taking it out on conservative students, where we see more threats against conservative students. We see more conservative students being sort of almost assaulted. I don't know if assault is the right word, that might be a little too strong. But we do see them being less drawing away from the situations where there are conservatives and more trying to be active in suppressing conservatives.
Wow. And what about if there is a positive side to this? Do you see any positive trends?
I would say so, absolutely. Every day, it's a rare day where I don't get a phone call from a student on some campus saying like, hey, this just happened, what do we do? How do we fix this? And so we have, through Young America's Foundation, we have our Young Americans for Freedom chapters. It was founded by Buckley back in 1960, so this is an organization with all this history. And even today, these students are the bold people who are standing up for true conservatism on their campuses. And I think anywhere you look where there's good stuff happening, today across the country at more than 200 high schools and colleges, these yaffers are setting up 2,977 flags to make sure that even if their school doesn't want the truth of today to be heard, they're bringing their school together to remind their peers what happened today. So I think all you have to do is look at that. And that is honestly the greatest part of my job, is giving the conservative movement, hopefully some optimism that the rising generation is conservative, our ideas are applicable to them, and they love conservative ideas. It's just they never get the chance to hear them because of these suppressions that are put on them by these leftists.
Do you think these kids have effects on other kids? Like, in other words, do you think they're I know there are not adults on the left who are willing to talk, but are there students on the left who are willing to?
Absolutely, and I don't even think they go into it thinking that they're going to be, acceptable or perceptive to hearing the other side. But a prime example, actually, when Ben spoke at California State University, Los Angeles, and it basically descended into riots, and you had Melina Abdullah and people, we had a professor threatening to fight our students, asking, "Do you lift, bro?" Just absolutely ridiculous stuff going on there. But there were students who showed up to protest that lecture that ultimately went on, but was just crazy. They pulled the fire alarm, everything else. But there were students who showed up to protest who today are some of the most active members of the YAF chapter on that campus, who are now out there trying to introduce their peers to the same ideas that literally changed their lives. And so you see, in that totally chaotic day that led to a lawsuit and everything, and we had to sneak students in 3 at a time through a back door with a police escort just to get them in a room to hear Ben Shapiro. But the people who are outside screaming about him being a fascist are now the ones working to bring in conservatives to their other peers.
That's a great story. I think I'll end there. That's terrific. Thank you very much. Spencer Brown from Young America's Foundation. That actually is good. Yeah.